Tricia Hersey is an African American activist, artist, theologian, and healer. Her research has focused on slavery, cultural trauma, and the commodification of Black bodies. In 2013, Tricia was a graduate student in a predominantly white divinity school. The Black Lives Matter movement was growing in the wake of more brutal murders. She was robbed, and she was exhausted. Tricia Hersey decided to rest. She napped. And she began what would later grow into the nap ministry. Calling herself the nap bishop, she insists on naps as radical resistance, rest as necessary for liberation. Come to me, Jesus says. Come, all you that are weary and carrying heavy burdens, and I will give you rest. Rest from our weariness. It can sound so inviting and also too good to be true. Some of our burdens are truly heavy right now. We are burdened with caring for others in ways we have not had to before, whether professionally or at home with children or elders. I have talked with some of you, and I hear your burden of loneliness, isolation, disconnection. We are wearied by the excessive technological intrusion into our lives, some of us zoomed out, and some feeling completely left out. Some are burdened with bills they no longer know how they will pay. Some of you, I know, are wearied by the centuries-long burden of oppression, the weight of being Black or a person of color in our country, or by being trans, queer, or otherwise marginalized in this society. As the scale of these pandemics becomes more clear, both the viral pandemic and the pandemic of systemic injustice, many of us are feeling wearied by our helplessness or by feeling inadequate. Rest sounds nice, but there's so much to be done that we feel guilty if we press pause on the work. Or we're so wearied that rest begins to sound like a deeper level of exhaustion. We think or act like we have to just keep going, just push through. Tricia Hersey, the nap bishop, says this is exactly backwards. She insists on rest as fundamental to the work itself. The nap ministry sets up public places for rest, artistic, liberative, beautiful spaces where people join the revolution to nap. Hersey teaches that our culture of endless productivity is inhumane. We live in a system that treats people as machines, that has long valued our ability to produce over our humanity. Particularly as a Black woman, for the nap bishop, to publicly nap is to subvert the oppressive system that has held rest as a luxury for the privileged few. She declares that we require space to sink into, to relish and restore our full humanity. Take a nap. Take 10 minutes to daydream. This is the work of liberation. These small acts disrupt the narrative that it all depends on us and that if we just try hard enough, we can do it all. Burnout happens to parts as they are ground down. It should not happen to human beings. Hersey prophetically proclaims that if we do not stop, rest, if we do not make time to grieve what is happening in the world and to lament the losses of our lives, if we do not intentionally set down our weariness from time to time, we inflict upon ourselves a continuing cycle of trauma that cannot heal. We have to be able to imagine, to actually dream of a just world in order to be able to build one. Take my yoke upon you, Jesus calls. This was a familiar image to his first century audience, used by rabbis to mean the duties required to fully comply with the law. Familiar or not, the imagery here is hard to submit to. The beam placed around the necks of animals and hooked up to a cart or plow for their labor? I think maybe I'd rather not. But through the eyes of the Nap bishop, I began to see that maybe we are, each of us, already yoked to a particular way of viewing our worth, our time, ourselves. We are yoked to systems that demand more of us than is humanly possible. Maybe it's not so much about taking on, but choosing what it is that we will be yoked to. The way Christ offers runs counter to the cultural demand for endless productivity, emphasizing instead gentleness and humility. My yoke is easy has, I think, been misused to proclaim that if you follow Jesus, everything will go well in your life. You will be prosperous, healthy, and live a life of ease. We cannot lift this section out of the context of Jesus' entire ministry, which is ultimately the way of persecution and death. To take on Christ's yoke is to take on a cruciform life, to be shaped into self-sacrificial people. And it is to work alongside Christ, not on our own, but with God's help to reshape the world into the ways of justice and peace. The burden is lightened as we recognize it is not ours alone. Our souls can rest, not because the work is done, but because our hope lies in God who is making all things new. This kind of rest is not denial. It is not inaction born of paralyzing fear or bone-weary exhaustion. It is life-giving liberation. One Commentator I listened to this week pointed out that "come to me" and "take my yoke" are imperative statements. I've always heard them as invitations gently issued. But what if they are commands? What if this is a necessary part of following Christ, choosing the rhythms of Sabbath and rest as fundamental to justice and liberation? Some of you probably aren't with me on this today. You're well rested and ready to jump into more of the work, and I am so very glad. In taking on this yoke and learning from Christ, we are called into Christ's own work, taking on another's burden, making space for people to rest their weary souls. Lean into that place of freedom and joy and find what other piece of liberation is yours to take on. But if you're not there yet, bring your burdens and your weary self to Jesus the Christ. Find what it is that you can put down for a while, what it is that you can learn about liberation in rest. This is an essential piece of living into our full God-given humanity and not as machines in a never-ending grind. Yes, there is work to be done. And yes, we will likely feel overwhelmed and disconnected for some time yet to come. But that does not mean we are obligated to just push through whatever the cost. Our spirits require time to slow down, to imagine, to just be. Take this yoke upon you. Come to Jesus and find rest for your souls.